Thank you for joining us on this first day of October. I'm Jonathan Hines, ERI's Assistant Director of Strategic Communications, and it's my pleasure to open today's webinar on the endangerment finding and the EPA's proposal to roll back this bedrock legal and scientific finding. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to let everyone know about a couple of upcoming events. First, if you haven't registered yet, our next webinar will be taking place Wednesday, November 5th. We'll be talking with IU climate scientist Travis O'Brien about extreme weather events in Indiana, as well as an effort being led by ERI to update the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment Report. That report first came out in 2018 and documented many of the ways climate change is affecting Indiana's environment and Hoosiers' lives. It should be a good one, and we'll post the link to register for this November 5th webinar in the chat. I also want to give everyone a heads up that ERI is knee-deep in planning the next Indiana Sustainability and Resilience Conference, which will be held Friday, February 6th in Bloomington. This is always a really fun day for sustainability-minded Hoosiers from all walks of life to network, share knowledge, and learn about the work taking place across Indiana that's really contributing to our state's resilience. Registration for the conference will be opening up later this month, so keep an eye out in your inbox for that announcement. And we've already got some great talks and presentations lined up for next year, and we anticipate the conference is going to fill up fast. So you're going to want to act sooner rather than later in registering for the conference and securing your spot. Now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. Janet McCabe is a former ERI director and has served 2 stints at the EPA, most recently as the EPA Deputy Administrator under the Biden administration. She recently returned to IU this summer, where she's serving as a visiting professor with the IU McKinney School of Law and the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, as well as a policy advisor with ERI. Steve Victor is an emeritus professor of physics at IU and a former associate director of Brookhaven National Laboratory for Nuclear and Particle Physics. Steve is a founding member of Concerned Scientists at IU, which is dedicated to strengthening the role of science and evidence-based decision-making at the local, national, and international levels. He's also co-author of the science blog debunkingdenial.com. If you have questions for either of our speakers, please enter them in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can after our speakers' presentations. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Janet.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan, and it's great to be here. Welcome to everybody who's joined. It's very exciting to be back at ERI and back with this webinar series. I just want to start with the IU neutrality statement and make clear that the comments that you're hearing today from me, I'll speak on behalf of myself, are not intended to be, shouldn't be construed as the views of Indiana University or made on behalf of or by Indiana University. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and Steve's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Here's what I want to cover today, just a basic explanation of what is this thing called the endangerment finding that everybody's talking about, give you a brief history of what it is and how its existence has manifested itself over the years. What EPA is proposing to do now, why it's important, and what happens next. And Steve, gratefully, thankfully, is going to be covering the science end of things, which I think you'll find very interesting. Just before I go into this slide, and it's fine to leave it up, I just want to let folks know that in 2009, I was at the EPA. That was my first opportunity to be at the EPA. And I was in the Office of Air and Radiation, which was the office responsible for putting together the endangerment finding. And I was there for both terms of the Obama administration, involved pretty directly in the work on the endangerment finding and then the subsequent regulatory activities that flowed from it, as I'll explain to you. So this is personal history to me as well as national history. So what is the endangerment finding? It was a rulemaking that was signed by then Administrator Lisa Jackson in 2009, towards the end of the year. It was issued under a section of the Federal Clean Air Act, the law that's been in place since the 70s, that directs EPA to address air pollution across the United States. This particular provision, it comes from the motor vehicles section of the Clean Air Act. And it was a determination by the administrator that 6 main greenhouse gases, which include CO2, methane, and several of others, that are emitted by motor vehicles may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. And I'll get into all this a little bit more in a minute. Let's go to the next slide, please. The endangerment finding was the legal basis for all of EPA's subsequent regulation of greenhouse gases from all kinds of different entities. And there have been a number of very important ones that have directed the reductions of greenhouse gases from the major sources of greenhouse gases in the country. While it was the legal basis for all of those regulations, it was primarily a science document. And it was consisted of a huge review of climate science that had been done to date, that was put before the administrator so that she could make a determination to follow the words of the Clean Air Act, which she in fact did. As I go through the history here, I just urge you to keep in mind, we're a democracy. We have elections. We have different people who are our president at various times, and those people have different policies. So I think it's hard to miss the connection between the activities that happened and what president was in office at that time. Let's go to the next slide, please. How did this all get started? Well, in 1999, a group of nonprofit organizations came to EPA. They brought a petition, which lots of people do all the time. You can do that under the Clean Air Act, asking the administrator to make this finding. And specifically to make the finding that greenhouse gases from motor vehicles were endangering public health and welfare. And that would then require EPA to set regulations to limit them. EPA doesn't always act promptly on petitions. And in this case, I think it was actually 2003 that EPA denied that petition. And it gave 2 reasons. One, it said, we don't have the authority under the Clean Air Act to grant this petition because CO2 and other greenhouse gases are not air pollutants. And then, as government agencies often do, it went on to say, even if we did, we are declining to make this finding as of this time for various policy reasons. It will interfere with international negotiations. It will interfere with the other ways the federal government was pursuing climate action at that time. So that's what the denial said. We can go to the next slide. This decision, as many decisions of EPA was challenged in the courts. And in 2007, the Supreme Court, in a very famous decision called Massachusetts versus EPA, ruled against EPA. The first issue that they had to decide was kind of a procedural one. They had to decide whether anybody actually had standing to bring this claim to the federal court. You know, you have to be able to show that you have an injury. All this history is very interesting. So I'll just tell you that the main plaintiff here was the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And they brought forward maps that showed how much of their coastline had been eroded by rising sea levels. And they said, we are in fact injured as a state sovereign because we're losing our coastline. And the court agreed with that and established that Massachusetts could bring this claim. It then went on to give the substantive ruling, which it said, absolutely, greenhouse gases are air pollutants within the meaning of the Clean Air Act. And it sent the decision back to EPA saying, you need to reconsider this petition. We're not going to tell you how you have to answer it, but you need to give a better reason than you gave last time. So that's what the court said in Massachusetts versus EPA. Next slide, please. So if you'll remember, in 2008, there was a presidential election. And in 2000, this was the first major thing that the Office of Air and Radiation was working on when the Obama administration came into office in early 2009. And by the end of that year, EPA was ready to give to Administrator Jackson to sign the endangerment finding. And I put the words of the statute on here because I think it illustrates what she was doing here. So she had to make a finding about whether these greenhouse gases may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and endanger public welfare. And if so, as I said a minute ago, then she had no choice but to issue regulations to reduce emissions of those greenhouse gases. So that's what she did. She made that finding. That then led to a number of regulations, which I'll talk about in a minute. Before doing that, though, I want to emphasize that this endangerment finding was also subject to a legal review and appeal, and it went to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is where EPA decisions go in the first instance. They upheld the finding, and the Supreme Court declined to review it. So it was upheld and strong law. Let's go to the next slide. The way the Clean Air Act works, and if you know me at all, you know how much I love the Clean Air Act. I just think it's has been a massively impactful piece of legislation in this country for the benefit of all of us. The endangerment finding started sort of it had a cascade effect. So it meant that EPA needed to regulate pollution of greenhouse gases from motor vehicles. Once it regulated greenhouse gases from motor vehicles, that meant that greenhouse gas emissions were regulated pollutants. And once you are a regulated pollutant, then you come into play in other parts of the Clean Air Act, specifically provisions that require EPA to issue regulations for stationary sources, what we might think about as factories, industrial operations, power plants, and that sort of thing. So the first thing that came out was the greenhouse gas regulations for motor vehicles. EPA, of course, has been regulating emissions from motor vehicles for decades. And so working the greenhouse gas reductions into the rule, it just became part of that whole set of motor vehicle regulations. But it then led to EPA developing regulations to focus on the next biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the country that were regulated by EPA, those being the fossil fuel-fired power sector, oil and gas operations, and actually landfills at that time were the next biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, in particular methane. So in 2015, we put out the Clean Power Plan, which you may have heard of. We put out regulations addressing methane emissions from oil and gas development. We put out a finding saying that greenhouse gases from aircraft endanger public health and welfare. And each time EPA did that, it relooked at the fundamental underpinnings of the science around climate and affirmed that that science was still strong. Each one of these rules was subject to its own challenges. And while courts differed on some things, in particular the Clean Power Plan, never went into effect, the endangerment piece, that basic underlying thing, and whether greenhouse gases should be considered air pollutants, that was never overturned. Let's go to the next. Before I talk about this, I should note that during the Biden administration, EPA issued several more rounds of regulations addressing greenhouse gas emissions from those industry sectors. As I said, the Clean Power Plan had been subject to judicial review and was invalidated. And so EPA put out a different power-related rule that followed the directions that the Supreme Court had given. And EPA, under the Clean Air Act, EPA is regularly required to update regulations. So that brings us to the current year and the proposal that came out on August 1st. The proposal that came out on August 1st proposed to withdraw, rescind, completely undo that 2009 endangerment finding. It also proposed to change EPA's motor vehicle regulations to eliminate the greenhouse gas standards, because if you don't have an endangerment finding anymore, you don't have that legal or scientific basis for regulating greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. Comments were due about a week ago. And we know that EPA is eager to move this rule forward speedily. The reason that they want to do that is because it will inevitably be challenged in court, and this administration will want to be still in office so that this Department of Justice will be the lawyers who are defending this final rule, presuming that they do affirm, that they do finalize what they proposed. Let's go to the next slide. So what did they say in this rule to justify undoing a legal and scientific finding that has withstood multiple appeals and seems to only be getting more sensible since it was issued in 2009? It has a number of different bases, and lawyers can think through these things and come up with all kinds of arguments for why you should or shouldn't be able to do something. So in this case, the high level of the legal basis is that they took a different view about what the Clean Air Act meant by air pollution, saying that it refers only to local or regionally impactful air pollution. Climate change obviously is a global phenomenon. They also said that they separated the impacts, the emissions that come from cars with the climate change harms. And of course, it's always been challenging to directly connect emissions of molecules of CO2 or methane from one particular source to a climate change impact. And it's not as direct as, for example, if you're emitting lead dust and that gets onto a windowsill and into a child, it's pretty easy to make that connection, or relatively easy to make that connection. But as Steve will tell you, it's getting more and more clear that these vast emissions of greenhouse gases around the country and around the world are causing the kinds of climate harms that we're seeing. And there are climate harms directly to Hoosiers and to people in the United States from that. They also said regulating these emissions would not meaningfully address the underlying harm. This is an argument that has been made over the years, which is if any one contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is only a tiny, tiny little part. And so why would you regulate cars? Because even if you took all the cars off the road, it still wouldn't meaningfully make a difference in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And you can make that argument if you want to. But the fact is that greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles are either the first or second largest contributor to the US greenhouse gas inventory. Cars and power plants sort of trade first and second place over time. And if we're going to reduce greenhouse gases, we're going to have to look at the largest sources of greenhouse gases, even if they, in the global pool, are a relatively small amount. Let's go to the next one. Steve's going to talk about this more, but basically the proposal said, questioned the scientific underpinnings of the endangerment finding and says that there's new information that says we were unduly pessimistic and the scientific basis isn't there. So I won't say any more about that because I know Steve's going to talk about it. So let's go to the next one. So I put this PowerPoint together before the comment deadline, but I know that many comments were submitted. They should all be public at some point. I don't think they are yet, so I don't know how many have come in, but I know that many people submitted comments. The quantity of comments, it's always great when a lot of people write in on a proposal, but the quantity of comments matters less than the content of those comments. Because under the Federal Administrative Procedures Act, any federal agency, in this case EPA, is required to respond to any relevant comment that comes in on a proposed rulemaking. And so when I talk to people about having impact in a comment, I urge them to include data that the agency didn't have or disregarded, to include factual information that sheds light on your position on that rulemaking that EPA will have to respond to. And if they don't, then that's a basis, that's a process basis to overturn the rule when it's ultimately challenged in court. So I know, because I got to see the draft comment that Concerned Scientists at IU put together, that there was a lot of specific information in there, and many other commenters have put extensive legal and scientific and policy arguments into the comment record. One of the controversial things about this rulemaking is that the science aspects of it pointed to a draft report that had been put out by the Department of Energy just right around the time of the proposal coming out. Lots of concerns and questions about that report, and I'm sure Steve will talk about that too. The National Academies of Science have recently put out their own review of climate science, which came out on September 17th, and that's a useful thing for people to look at too. Let's go to the next one. We must be getting close to the end here. Assuming that this rule is finalized and the endangerment finding is withdrawn, well, what happens? Well, it will be challenged, of course, right away. We know that this agency is going to be acting to pull back all of the greenhouse gas regulations that are in existence now for power plants, for oil and gas, for landfills. And they will continue to proceed on that course, I presume. But if the withdrawal of the the endangerment finding is upheld by a court, it actually would be pretty significant in terms of undermining and doing away with EPA's ability under this Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. And another significant issue is that there are lots of states around the country, including Indiana, that have provisions that say they're not allowed at the state level to adopt any rule that's more stringent than what the federal rules require. And so if there's no endangerment finding, it would be very difficult for a state with one of those provisions to move forward with their own greenhouse gas regulations. There are a number of states that have their own climate regulatory programs, and it will be interesting to see what approach EPA takes towards those states if and when they finalize the withdrawal of the endangerment finding. Let's go. So I'm about done here and ready to turn it over. There's lots and lots of resources. Here's links to some of the key documents. I just wanted to finish up by noting when EPA put the proposal out in there, not in the rule itself, but in the one pager, they introduced it by saying a couple of things that it's very hard as a person who was there to not respond to. They said that the rules are costing the American people trillions of dollars. They said that this is climate overreach, and they said that EPA was never held to account for making this decision. There's really, in as far as I can tell, I cannot figure out where they come up with the number of trillions of dollars. Each time EPA does a rule, they have to evaluate both the costs and the benefits of each rule. And the rules that I was involved in had costs in the billions of dollars, not trillions of dollars. But what they also reflected was the cost saved to the American people from the improvements to public health and economic vitality from reducing greenhouse gases and the other pollutants that would be reduced through those rules. Climate overreach, and people can judge for themselves, but I think when Steve shows you his information, you'll see that for many people, there's no question that climate change is a real thing that we should be concerned about as a matter of public policy. And to say that EPA was never held to account for these things disregards what I've told you about the numerous times these very issues were litigated in court and upheld by courts. This is a very important issue. I'm glad you're here to listen to this program. I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the end of the program. And now I will turn it over to Steve.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk about this detailed comment on the proposal that was put in by the concerned scientists at IU. I'm going to emphasize the scientific and technical arguments, which I called on this intro slide gobbledygook, because they're weakly worded and weakly argued claims. Let's go to the next slide. The Concerned Scientists Group at IU has a student affiliate organization, Advocates for Science at IU. These are grassroots, nonpartisan community organizations. We have over 1,000 members. They're scientists, students, and supporters of science from the entire South Central Indiana region. And while many of our members are faculty, students, or staff at IU, our organization does not officially represent the university. We're dedicated to strengthening the essential role of science in public policy and evidence-based decision-making. So go to the next slide, please. So as Janet indicated, CSIU has submitted one of what is now 350,000 comments on the EPA proposal. We submitted on September 9th. We have a long and detailed comment that provides demonstrations that every aspect of EPA's major arguments on legal, scientific, and technical grounds are all unsound. The legal argument in particular we show is at odds with the clear language of the original statute, that is the Clean Air Act. It's at odds with the Inflation Reduction Act and with the Supreme Court ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA. What I mean by at odds, for example, Janet said that the EPA's reading of the Clean Air Act is that it only refers to local or regional impacts. That is simply an impossible reading of the Clean Air Act, because the Clean Air Act has a section on international impacts of US air pollution. So it's simply not solely focused on local and regional impacts. Our comment also provides context, which is missing from the EPA proposal. If you click once more, please, Alexandra. One of the contexts is that, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, the US is the largest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. China emits more total because of their huge population, but on average, each person in the US emits about 15 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, and the US has to be a part of an international effort to reduce greenhouse gases. Click again, please, Alexandra. Within the US right now, in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, the transportation sector, shown here in black, has now overtaken for the last decade the electric power generation sector as the largest emitter of carbon dioxide. And click again once more. So US vehicles now, passenger vehicles and trucks, cumulatively emit 1.5 billion tons of CO2, that's metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. That's about 3% of all global emissions. So it's not negligible. We'll come back in a little while to that 3% number. Next slide, please. So one should understand that this EPA proposal is a part of a systematic attempt by the Trump administration to undermine both the science and the danger of climate change. Donald Trump, of course, on day one, withdrew the US from the Paris Climate Accord. And he just last weekend told the United Nations that Western countries were going to hell for investing in what he called the Green New Scam. OMB Director Russell Vought, in the proposed budget from the president for fiscal year 26, said the budget was eliminating funding for the globalist climate agenda, the Green New Scam, and unreliable renewable energy. In a previous version of that budget proposal, Vought had said it was putting an end to woke climate research, which led me to conclude that everything seems woke to people who are asleep at the wheel. DOE Secretary Chris Wright handpicked 5 fringe climate scientists. Actually, it was 4 fringe climate scientists and a fringe economist to draft the 2025 Climate Working Group report, which was filled with half or much less than half truths and debunked arguments. So among the many comments that were submitted on that DOE report, one put together by more than 85 leading climate experts called the DOE report a mockery of science. They said it was biased, full of errors, and not fit to inform policymaking. But nonetheless, EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has relied exclusively on that DOE report in making scientific and technical arguments, which I put in quotes, supporting the rescission of the endangerment finding. So in the CSIU comment, we have addressed every one of those scientific and technical arguments. I don't have time to go through all of them, so I'm going to go through some examples. The first example is Lee Zeldin says in the EPA proposal, notwithstanding increased public attention to heat waves, the data suggests that domestic temperatures peaked in the 1930s and have remained more or less stable in relative terms since those highs. That's an extremely misleading statement. What's shown here are the data collected by NOAA on the left for the 48 contiguous US states, and on the right for the entire globe. It is true that the US saw some heat waves during the 1930s associated with the Dust Bowl. That was a local regional effect in the lower 48 US states. It doesn't show up at all in the right-hand plot for the globe. And it's nothing like the steady increase in annual mean temperatures, which is seen for both the contiguous US states on the left and for the globe on the right. The only difference is that when you average over the full globe, the year-to-year fluctuations, which are associated with things like El Nino and La Nina, are smoothed out over the globe. So the Dust Bowl peaks in the 1930s are a regional effect, nothing like the ongoing warming. Furthermore, if you go to the next slide, the implication that heat waves are not a problem is simply wrong. Heat wave impacts depend on the frequency and the spatial and temporal extent of high temperatures. So what this graph shows are heat wave characteristics collected for 50 large US cities from 1961 to 2023. The upper graph here, the upper bar chart in gold, shows the average number of heat waves per year going decade by decade for these 50 large cities. The lower bar chart in maroon shows the average length of heat wave season for these 50 large cities, again, decade by decade from the 1960s to the 2020s. And what you see is that the temperature records from these 50 large US cities indicate clearly that the frequency of heat waves and the average length of heat wave season in the US has nearly tripled since the 1960s. So to imply that heat waves have not been a problem caused by global warming is simply untrue. The size of the dots for the 50 cities, by the way, just indicate which of those 50 cities have been most impacted in frequency of heat waves and in the length of heat wave season. For example, some of these cities have seen heat wave seasons grow by more than 80 days from the 1960s to the 2020s. Next slide, please. So, second example, Zeldin says recent data and analyses suggest, however, that despite increased public attention and concern, such extreme weather events have not demonstrably increased relative to historical highs. This is a very misleading statement, which is drawn from Steve Koonen's book, Unsettled. Steve Koonen was one of the 5 authors of this recent DOE report. It is refuted by actuarial statistics. What Koonen does in his book is he takes a divide and conquer approach. He takes each possible impact of global warming one by one and finds a historical period where there were also anomalies in that single impact, but they were different historical periods for each impact. He never addresses the fact that all these impacts are occurring simultaneously now. So what's shown in this graph are statistics maintained by Munich Re, which is the world's largest reinsurance company. They show the number year by year from 1980, when they started collecting these statistics, to 2018 in this plot, of just the number of serious global disasters, natural disasters each year. And by serious, they mean ones that have caused fatalities or large financial losses. And the color coding here is such that the brown bars at the bottom of the bar graphs represent earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes, which are not caused by global warming. And you see that the frequency of those remains about constant. But the green, blue, and gold bars represent climate-related disasters, severe storms, floods, heat waves, droughts, forest fires. And those bars have, as if you click once more, all severe climate-related catastrophes have tripled in frequency since 1980. So again, to imply that these climate change impacts are not serious is a false statement. Next slide, please. This is the third example. Again, I'm quoting from the EPA proposal. Recent data and analyses suggest that attributing adverse impacts from climate change to anthropogenic emissions in a reliable manner is more difficult than previously believed and demand additional analysis of the role of natural factors and other anthropogenic factors such as urbanization and localized population growth. Again, this is an entirely misleading statement. Global climate models are unable to explain the ongoing warming without anthropogenic emissions, but the models have uncertainties and you don't need to rely on them at all to see that humans are the primary cause. So click once more, please. Yes, click to show that graph again, please. Empirical data show that the increase in atmospheric CO2 simply tracks the post-industrial increase in the human burning of fossil fuels. So this is a plot from the Energy Information Administration. What it shows, the brown curve, is the increasing carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere from 1750. This plot went to about 2010. This is related to the right-hand scale. The carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is by now up to about 428 parts per million. It was stable, by the way, for the 10,000 years of human civilization before the post-industrial era, where humans have started to emit greenhouse gases. The emission of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning is in blue, and it is that human burning of fossil fuels which has led to the increase in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Go to the next slide, please. So what do those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere do? They trap infrared radiation, the thermal radiation emitted by the Earth. The thermal radiation emitted by the Earth should follow a black body spectrum, such as indicated by the red curve in this plot. What the blue band shows is the actual infrared radiation that reaches Earth satellites, or reaches the top of Earth's atmosphere. And instead of reaching the red curve, you see these large deficits, which correspond to the absorption ranges of the various greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the big dip near the peak of the emission curve. There are also dips from water vapor, nitrous oxide, and methane. As you increase greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the dips, the deficits get larger, and that means that more of the heat is retained in the lower atmosphere and returned to the surface of the Earth. Let's click again. That means that the Earth warms. The plot at the bottom here is from the Berkeley Earth website. This shows the correlation between global mean temperature measured since 1850 up to about 2020, plotted versus the independently measured carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And you see that it's a very clear, strong correlation. Click once more, please. So well-established physics supports that the fact that that correlation is going to continue as you continue to build up greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That curve is going to continue to grow as these dips in the spectrum get larger. Eventually that saturates so that the curve will start to saturate, but it's going to increase throughout this century. When we will reach various points on this curve depends on what we do about greenhouse gas emissions. If we continue on our present trajectory, the greenhouse gas, the carbon dioxide concentration will double by about 2060 and triple by the end of the century, when temperatures will have increased by about 4 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial level. Go to the next slide, please. Oh, by the way, I should also mention that the implication that urbanization affects the global warming is false. The Berkeley Earth Project analyzed many tens of thousands of monitoring stations around the Earth. The urban stations indeed tend to measure higher absolute temperatures than rural stations, but the change in temperature is the same. The Berkeley Earth Project found that if you eliminate all urban and near urban monitoring stations, you get the same increase in global temperature. from the pre-industrial era. So again, that's a false statement in the EPA proposal. Fourth example, the lack of analysis of adaptation generally, and particularly with respect to sea level rise, reduces confidence in the reasonableness, accuracy, and reliability of the assumptions and conclusions in the endangerment finding. Click again. Again, this is misleading. You can't do adaptation and deal with climate adaptation alone. Adaptation will be needed, but in concert with greenhouse gas emission reductions. With respect to sea level rise is accelerating. Click once more, please, Alexandra. That's shown in this plot on the bottom left. This is a plot of the rate of global mean sea level rise in millimeters per year. The blue band are measurements starting from the beginning of the 20th century from tide gauges. The red band in more recent years is from satellite measurements. Those agree. What all this shows is that sea level has been rising throughout the 20th and 21st century, but the rate of rise has been increasing steadily since about 1970. Sea level rise is accelerating. There have been simulations now of the amount of migration that will necessitate by the end of this century if greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise at their present level. Click once more, please, Alexandra. This is the result of a simulation by Robinson et al. Of the migration that will be necessitated in the US from coastal regions by the end of the century. And they conclude that up to 10 million Americans will be displaced by 2100. The blue curve at the bottom here is the number of people in millions that will be forced out of coastal regions by flooding. The purple curves represent the inhabitants of inland counties whose population will grow by 9% or more, 6% or more, et cetera, from the migrants moving inland from flooded coastal regions. So many millions of Americans will be forced to move, and many millions of Americans, many more millions of Americans will be impacted by growing population, rapidly growing population in their counties. That will all be extremely expensive. Adaptation will be at least as and probably more expensive than greenhouse gas emission mitigation. Next slide, please. This is the last example I'll go through. Zeldin says there is no requisite technology for emission control for light and medium duty vehicles because reducing GHG emissions from such vehicles to zero would not measurably impact greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere or the rate of global climate change. So click. This is kind of a ridiculous argument. They agree that if vehicle emissions were reduced to zero in the US, that would be a 3% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions. They say that's negligible because the uncertainties in climate models are larger than 3%. And that argument makes no sense. I mean, first of all, 3% reduction is not negligible, regardless of climate model uncertainties, which have nothing to do with that. If every country that has contributed to greenhouse gas emissions was to decide that a few percent gains are not worth it, then humans will have made the decision by pocket veto to not deal with the severe problems they have created by ongoing climate change, ongoing global warming. And the requisite technology is not only clear, it's moving toward electrical vehicle fleets, but it is explicitly called for in Title VI of the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, which, although Lee Zeldin essentially ignores it in the EPA proposal, remains the law of the land. The Title VI of the Inflation Reduction Act was essentially a codification of the endangerment finding. It is part of US law now, and the EPA proposal simply ignores it. Go to the next slide, please. How is the US doing on moving toward electrical vehicle fleets? Not very well. This bar chart is the fraction of new vehicle sales in various developed countries in 2020 that were plug-in electric vehicles. In Norway, 75% of new vehicle sales were EVs, in Iceland 45%, Sweden 32%, and so on. United States is down at the bottom here at 2%. So if Norway can have 75% EVs in their new vehicle sales, why is the US lingering at 2%? Go to the next slide, please. So I just want to conclude now. First, let me start with the final conclusion of the Supreme Court ruling in this Massachusetts versus EPA case that Janet talked about. This is from the SCOTUS ruling. Under the clear terms of the Clean Air Act, EPA can avoid taking further action only, and that's my emphasis, if it determines that greenhouse gases do not contribute to climate change, or if it provides some reasonable explanation as to why it cannot or will not exercise its discretion to determine whether they do. The conclusion of our CSIU comment with regard to the scientific arguments is that we find that the present proposal fails utterly to demonstrate that greenhouse gases do not contribute meaningfully to climate change. The scientific rationale offered in this proposal for rescinding the endangerment finding is shallow, sloppy, unsubstantiated, and ultimately unable to meet the legal standard laid out by SCOTUS. Next slide, please. The final conclusion of our comment, dealing with all aspects, all rationales the EPA offers, is that we urge rejection of all proposed rationales for rescinding the 2009 endangerment finding. The legal, scientific, and technical arguments made in the proposal are at odds with the clear language of the Clean Air Act and of the Inflation Reduction Act, the SCOTUS ruling in Massachusetts versus EPA, the vast majority of international global warming and climate change research, and the efforts being pursued in most other industrialized countries to reduce vehicular emissions of greenhouse gases. If you want to read our comment, which is about 30 pages long, it's available at the CSIU website, csiub.org/news. The EPA proposal attracted a total of 351,300 comments, of which, as of this morning, actually 1,400, or about 0.4%, have been posted for public access. The EPA is currently posting for public access about 200 per day. I don't know if that means that those are the ones they have addressed. If they're addressing a few hundred per day, they may get through the 350,000 by the end of the Trump administration. The CSIU comment, which I think will be difficult for them to address, is not one of the posted comments yet. And now I'll open it for questions.
Thanks, Steve. We have a few minute questions. If you have any questions, you can enter them in the chat and we'll try to get to them. We have one question entered previously about regulating transportation emissions and whether a policy could be written to regulate transportation emission, all forms of transportation emissions, rather than separate policies for things like cars and planes. Janet, do you want to address that one?
Sure. Well, the Clean Air Act divides the transportation world up to a certain degree. Aircraft is dealt with in its own way. Um, uh, and there are lots of differences between different kinds of transportation. So, for example, cars and vans and gasoline-powered vehicles that are used a lot by all of us, just regular consumers, have certain kinds of technologies, are used in different ways. Heavy duty vehicles, trucks primarily, are often fueled by diesel. They have very different sorts of technologies, and they're work vehicles. And so people think about them, the industry thinks about them in a different way than motor vehicles that are mostly for the US consumer. So there would be some challenges to doing that, both from the way the Clean Air Act is structured, and just the mechanics of trying to do this. I mean, you could try to envision a great big trading system, I suppose, that brought all transportation together. EPA has developed trading programs in the past, and in fact, within the light duty vehicle rule, the automakers have the ability to trade back and forth. It would get very, very complex, I think, to include all modes of transportation. The other point in that comment is, should each of the Kyoto gases have been identified individually and their impact identified? That is one of the arguments that's made in the proposal, and we'll see how the courts view a change in view on that. In the 2009 endangerment finding, there was a lot of discussion about why the agency looked at the 6 well-mixed gases. For an agency to change its rationale, it's got to give a reasoned rationale to do it. And so that one, I think, will be up to the courts to decide.
Great. We have another question about electric vehicle charging infrastructure and whether other countries who are adopting electric vehicles at a higher rate than the US already have charging infrastructure in place. Do you know anything about that, Steve?
Yes, I think countries, especially the Scandinavian countries, have been very proactive, not only about providing subsidies for purchases of electric vehicles, but providing the charging infrastructure around the country. You know, the Inflation Reduction Act certainly provided funds for enhancing the infrastructure in the US, but many of the funds provided in the Inflation Reduction Act have been rescinded by the Trump administration.
And we have another question about the auto industry and whether we have any opinion about whether auto manufacturers will try to comply with newer emission standards, or if rolling back the endangerment finding will cause for a rollback in emission compliance, or
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it gives me the opportunity to make the following point, which is that these policies have definitely been on a roller coaster here since 2009, depending on who was in the White House. But the fact is that both the power sector and the motor vehicle sector have been steadily getting cleaner. With cars and motor vehicles in particular, I would not want to be the head of a major car company for so many reasons. But just think of the responsibility that you have and the cycle that these entities have to think in is not a 4-year election cycle. They have to be designing and anticipating years in advance what kind of cars the American public is going to want to buy. and what the fuel options are going to be, and what the infrastructure is going to be, and all of those things. It's very, very challenging. And in all my years of being a government regulator, industry has always said, you know, we can't have uncertainty. We need to have as much certainty as possible, which they certainly do not have under these circumstances. So I would expect that there will still continue to be investment in clean technology, whether it's motor vehicles or power plants. Partly that has to do with cost. As the costs come down to build cleaner technology, the industry will do it. As the consumer demands cleaner technology, for whatever reason, they care about climate change, or they don't want to pay for gas anymore, or they want an electric vehicle where you never have to do any oil changes, and the only maintenance you have is your windshield wipers and tire pressure. Those things they will respond to. So I think we will continue to see progress, but definitely if the rules are rescinded, it will not go as quickly.
Yeah, I should just add to that actually electric vehicle battery costs have been dropping fairly rapidly, and electric vehicle costs have also been dropping fairly rapidly over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I mean, range anxiety is a real thing. I have a Bolt, and I absolutely have range anxiety, but that will diminish over time as people get more comfortable that there will be places to recharge, and that it will go faster, and as the batteries get to have a longer range.
Well, thank you so much, Janet and Steve. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for your attention and for your questions. We hope to see you next month. Have a good afternoon, everyone.